the head of the Senate. The garbage that comes out of their mouths is like, oh my goodness, we need 1,000 dumpsters to get rid of it. And that's always garbage about what the Democrats aren't doing. Well, let's hold on a second. You guys are the majority leaders of the two chambers of Congress, but yet you keep blaming the Democrats for the things that are not getting done. You know, I've been criticized for criticizing Schumer and Jeffries. Well, when necessary, I'm going to say things that I think are important to encourage them to do better and push them to do better and stop sending fancy-dancy letters. You know, knock some tables over. There's nothing wrong with asking our people to do more, because we know those on the right aren't going to help in this process of making things better for the country. So don't fall to the whims of the narrative that the right wants to be our narrative. And that's why I'm very careful. And I'm going to add into that statement, the mainstream media. Don't fall into their, I mean, I'll give you a good example. I didn't see it. I heard about it. So I'm speaking from what I heard rather than from what I actually saw. And then I saw the clip and I was like, okay. But the possibility that someone would say in the media, Joe Scarborough, that Governor Pritzker should partner up and should work with Donald Trump when it comes to the National Guard is absolute insanity. They want that to be part of our narrative. And I say that because I'm not, you know, Joe and Mika, whatever. They're made up really well to look pretty to be on the air in the morning, but they're not, you know, whatever. You know, I'm not going to brag a little, but I'm just going to state something that, you know, there are many people that could do what they do. And I would put myself on that list, and, you know, and I could sit with a number of people that we could get that job done. So for Joe Scarborough to be saying something like that's what J.B. Pritzker should be doing, okay, whatever, Joe. You're the same dude that went down. You see, and see that's kind of tells a little bit about his personality. Let's kneel to the superior one, like you and your, you know, person, your wife and your co-host went down to Mar-a-Lago. Remember earlier in the year we were saying you can't go to Mar-a-Lago? Well, that still stands. And you can't bend the knee to the whims and to the dialogue and the narrative that those on the right want. No. So we have to keep creating our own narrative, keep pushing our own narrative, and keep it strong. That means giving, for us as individual, you know, voters and folks that are out here, we have to, you know, remind our leaders on our side of the aisle, if you will, that to keep working hard, and we have to keep encouraging them and pushing them to do the work that they've got to do for all of the American people, not just the folks that voted for them. Because that, if we want to talk about trickle down, that is definitely what the White House is trying to do with the leaders in the respective chambers, is get them to tell people to do only what they want them to do and only really be caring about the people that are ones that voted for them. And you can see it based on their conversations and their press conferences. It's not about solving things. It's about blaming the Democrats. So we that are not elected officials should be able to say, no, I'm not going to pick up that narrative. I'm going to fight forward and, along with other people, create a narrative that's right for all of us. And we're going to continue to deliver that narrative and not get caught up in some of the things that the Republicans want us to get caught up in. I may talk about that a little bit with Congressman Jackson when he's on. But we'll see how that goes. But for now, we're going to take a little bit of a break. All right, everything looks good. You're listening to Choose Views on WCPT AM 820 in Chicago and WARR 1520 AM and 103.5 FM in Warren County, North Carolina. I'm Richard Chu. We'll be right back.
This is your WCPT Progressive Calendar. Tuesday, September 16th at 5:30 p.m., the Chicago Council on Global Affairs will host a panel discussion called Retreat or Resilience, Responding to Global Democratic Decline. Panelists include Norman Eisen, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, and Susan Stokes, Director of the Chicago Center on Democracy. Visit globalaffairs.org to learn more and register to attend. Tuesday, September 30th at 5 p.m., the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern University welcomes Ali Zaidi for a distinguished public policy lecture. Zaidi headed the White House Climate Policy Office during the Biden administration and served as President Biden's top advisor on domestic climate policy. The event is free and takes place at White Auditorium, 2211 Campus Drive in Evanston.
You're listening to WCPT 820. Here's the latest Chicago weather update.
From the Weatherology Weather Center, I'm meteorologist Jennifer Wojcicki. We'll see sunny skies here for today with a high in the upper 60s. Northwest winds of 5 to 10 miles per hour, gusting as high as 20. Then for tonight, partly cloudy, a low near 56. By Friday, sunshine, breezy, high of 66 degrees. Then on Saturday, plenty of blue skies and sun, a high around 68. Sunday, mostly sunny, high of 67. That's your latest Chicago weather update.
Currently, it's 51.
Nearly 1 in 2 U.S. adults have high blood pressure. That's why it's important to self-monitor your blood pressure in 4 easy-to-remember steps. It starts with a monitor. Be next to talk to your doctor about your blood pressure numbers. Get down with your blood pressure. Self-monitoring is power. Visit managerbp.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council, the American Heart Association, and the American Medical Association, in partnership with the Office of Minority Health and Health Resources and Services Administration.
A frog in boiling water and it'll jump right out. But put a frog in cool water and slowly heat it up, that frog will boil. As veterans, we tell ourselves the lie that we can handle anything. We let the water boil. You are not a frog. If you or a veteran you know needs support, don't wait. Reach out. Find resources at va.gov/reach. That's va.gov/reach. Brought to you by the United States Department of Veterans Affairs and the Ad Council.
Did you know that more than 90% of poisonings happen at home? Look closely and you will find poison risks hidden in plain sight inside every house. But there are actions you can take to poison-proof your home, like keeping household cleaners locked up high and away from children, properly labeling and securing medicines and supplements, and installing carbon monoxide detectors near bedrooms and furnaces. Visit poisonhelp.hrsa.gov to learn more, or call your local poison center at 1-800-222-1222, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Because facts matter. You're listening to WCPT 820.
This is Choose Views with Richard Chew.
Hey guys, welcome back to the show. Today on Live, Local, and Progressive, Marge Halpern will be here for Joan Esposito, and she'll be talking to Illinois State Representative Cam Buckner, Illinois State Senator Graciela Guzman, Robert Creamer of Democracy Partners, Jonah Minkoff-Zern of Public Citizen, Grace Chan McKibben, Executive Director of the Coalition for Better Chinese American Community, Pam Dickler, writer and performer of I Killed Andy Breitbart, playing September 6th and 7th at the Apollo Theater in Chicago. Plus, Marge will be giving away tickets for a new Northlight Theater production that opens today at the North Shore Center for Performing Arts in Skokie. And Friday, Professor William Muck will be back in, and he'll be joined by Thomas Countryman, former acting Undersecretary for State of Arms Control and International Security. That is Live, Local, and Progressive, 2 to 5, here on WCPT, Progressive Talk, Chicago's Progressive Talk, for 20 years. Tonight on Driving It Home, Patty Vasquez will be broadcasting from Los Angeles, as we mentioned earlier in the week. Driving It Home with Patty Vasquez, weekdays 5 to 7, here on WCPT, the Heartland Signal website, TuneIn, YouTube, and Facebook. And tomorrow we should be talking with our regular guest, Karen Byrne from True Blue Politics Podcast. And then Mayor Brandon Johnson will be joining me for an extended edition of This Month with the Mayor. So we look forward to today's shows and tomorrow's shows. as I said before, not only do we have a great bench of future leaders, but we have a fantastic group of currently elected officials representing not only the state of Illinois, but the country at large. And with us this morning, which I'm so happy to speak with, is Congressman Jonathan Jackson, who represents Illinois' 1st Congressional District. Legendary roots of activism and just achievement and hard work and making sure that people's lives are made better. Good morning, Congressman, and welcome to the show.
Good morning, Brother Chu. How are you, sir?
I'm good. I'm fired up and ready to go, as former President Obama would say, and I can tell you are as well. I'm so glad to have you on the show this morning. I know that, man, you're back and getting it done, and so happy to have you with us this morning. I hope you're doing well.
I'm doing great, and the fight is real, and thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I said before you came on the early part of the show is this conversation around our narrative versus the narrative of a quote-unquote other side. And what I mean by that is we want to encourage our elected officials to take the message to the people and to fight hard against the quote-unquote other side of the aisle. And so my perspective has always been to do whatever we can to encourage you guys as our elected representatives to be able to be in that fight and not have to turn around and wonder, are the voters still supporting us? So when you were away during the congressional break, what were some of the things that constituents were telling you during the August recess? What were some of the things that you heard? And what are you saying, okay, to your colleagues on the left? Here are the things that we're really hearing on the ground. What are some of those things that folks were talking to you about?
Well, it's two things, one of which is to answer your question, is there a lot of concerns about the Medicaid and the SNAP, particularly in the 1st Congressional District. We have the most Medicaid recipients in one district in the entire state, over 258,000 people. We've got a concentration of safety net hospitals, which has essentially, they do great work there, but they're under-resourced, and the formula for their funding has been really bad, so that's a challenge. And you go from the point of being able to share, to hear from people on what's top of mind to them, as well as having access to information, to sharing with people what's coming down the pipeline. And so there's not been much conversation on this one big, beautiful bill that's really ugly, really nasty, and really hurtful, that people really haven't registered the impact of what this thing is going to do on how transformative it is. And so I want people to understand, like, hey, we need to start gearing up for what these cuts are looking like. The other part is what's happening on this redistricting. That's something that on the leadership part that I have to share with people, what's coming down the pipeline. We're beating the Republicans in the polls, but we're losing in the courts. And so this has just been signaled in this Louisiana versus Callis case to go and take congressional seats because they cannot win them in an outright election. There were 3 Democratic seats that were lost to the courts in North Carolina this past election cycle, and Kathy Manning, Jeff Jackson, and Mr. Wiley in North Carolina, those 3 seats would have meant the difference in the Democrats being the majority in the House. So Medicaid and SNAP is a huge concern, and of course the rising food costs and housing costs are really beginning to choke people out. And the third part of which is the tariffs. Like, what does this mean? How is it on? How is it off? And so people are naturally frustrated with the lawmakers saying, "Hey, why aren't you all doing more?" They stopped obeying the law, and so it kind of caught everyone off guard. And we're making our voices heard, and I think there are things that we can do to up the ramp on it. We should have had a government shutdown earlier in the year, but Schumer had overridden that, and things just have to come to a screeching halt because it's broken.
Yeah. So I heard that there was a big conversation around shutting down the government at the end of this month of September. What will that mean if that ends up being the direction that you guys go? I mean, how are we going to be able to then bounce back from that if that's the direction that we take?
Well, basically it's saying is that you have to abide by the law, that when the judges tell you that you have overreach and that you are breaking the law, what else can you do but stop empowering him? For example, when the tariffs is clearly stated in the Constitution, that is under the purview and the domain and responsibility of the United States Congress. You really don't want to have your president to also be in charge of the economy. That's why there's a check and the balance. What you have is, how do you get the tariff on? The president wakes up and says he wants it with no debate, no discussion. How do you get it off? You go to Mar-a-Lago, you go to one of the golf courses, and after a weekend, somehow from a smoke-filled room, the tariff comes off. So they're all sort of chicanery and backroom deals. Like, what's going on? When he says that we've just negotiated these great deals with these other countries, who negotiated what? Like, there's no details on any of these deals that they say are being created for new trade relations. If the Congress is supposed to have this conversation, when they passed the Affordable Care Act, there were hearings and there were amendments that Democrats had put in there, and Republicans had been accepted. Over 120 Republican amendments had been accepted to the Affordable Care Act. There were no hearings for the one big bill. None. There was no conversation. There were no Democrats' input. One of the amendments I had put in there, since I'm on the Ag Committee, was to have to make sure that we would have the work requirements, that they would not make it for people under able-bodied adults without children, did not have to continue to seek work over the age of 55, 54, and under the age of 14. That was not accepted. So now, under this current bill, you're going to have people that are going to be up to age 63, 65 looking for work because they don't have children at home when their health is failing. And I asked one of my colleagues, I said, hey, when you get older, you have to take care of your parents. Can you put your parents on your insurance? Are your parents your dependent when you get older? He says, I never thought about that, Jonathan, because we never had a hearing on it.
Wow. So by not having it.
So for the people that have to care for their parents, they're like trapped.
Yeah. It's not only is it the sandwich, being part of the sandwich generation, but it's also there's no support systems. Or your real point here is transparency. That's the word that I wrote down. It's transparency. There was no transparency with this bill, and there is no transparency that's coming from the Republican Party. Let's talk about numbers. I mean, one of the big concerns that everybody has right now is the redistricting, and you mentioned that in terms of some of the court cases. Right here in Illinois, we know that Governor Pritzker is navigating that, but we see what Governor Newsom's doing out in California. We've heard Governor Hochul talk about what she might do in New York, Governor Moore, and others. So we're close right now in the House of Representatives, and we know that in this next election, the midterms, that's critically important that we take back the House. Whether we take back the Senate or not is a different conversation. But taking back the House will create a firewall for Democrats and the country. So how realistic, Congressman, is that without the redistricting? And then the other side of it is, will the redistricting actually afford us the ability to take back the House?
We cannot win that game when people talk about we have to fight fire with fire. Well, there are 30 states that have supermajority Republicans, and there are 20 that have Democrats. So state-wise, they will have the leg up, if you will. And so even though 4 million people grew into the state of Texas, for example, and these were minority participations of Spanish-speaking population, African Americans went into Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and Austin. There were no increases in Democratic seats or African American representation. And now the president says, I want you to signal to go get me 5 more seats. So through the process of gerrymandering, they're further diluting the districts in the concentration where you can have maximum representation. And because of that, Texas has gone in and said that they're going to do redistricting. Missouri went into session yesterday and said they're going to do redistricting. So they're going after Emmanuel Cleaver. They're going after targeting, from what I can see, 40% of the African-American jurisdiction, congressional seats across the country. That's Missouri. Ohio is on the ballot with Emilia Sykes. Louisiana's on the ballot with Congressman Cleo Fields and with Cory Carter. So they're moving in these Republican seats. The Supreme Court has just lied down. So there is a Supreme Court case, Louisiana versus Callis, that should be decided in mid-October that can either put a finger in this dam or they can break it. And if they break it, what will happen is you can see a reduction of almost 30 to 40% of Hispanic and African-American representatives losing their seats in the House of Representatives.
That many seats, or that many, the percentage of voters? So you're saying that so 30% of the seats that are currently there, I mean, that's 60. Is that 60 seats that we're talking about? Or are you talking about voters?
62. So you could be looking at 20 seats that we could possibly lose.
Wow. That's so this case in Louisiana, it's a federal case then, correct?
Correct. And so Congressman Cleo Fields, a little bit on the background, Congressman Cleo Fields, a dear friend of mine, he's the first person I ever wrote a campaign contribution to. Went to Southern University, law school, all the other good things, became the youngest state senator in Louisiana history, young African-American gentleman in Baton Rouge, then went on to get into the Congress at the age of 29, stayed there for two and a half terms. They did a mid-district, a mid-year, a mid-decade redistricting map because he was sued by none other than Ku Klux Klan member David Dukes. And so David Dukes took him to the Supreme Court. They were decided against them, so they redrew the district, and they lost their second representative out of 7 seats. There were 2 African-Americans, so then it went down to 1. And then 20 years later, he ran for state senate and ran for Congress again and won. So he was sworn in this past January 3rd. By February of this year, a group essentially under the Trump doctrine of theory sued, saying that because race was used as a consideration in creating this seat, it harmed white representation. So when they're using the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law against African Americans, that's how cynical this court and this administration is. They're basically saying that white males have been discriminated against by African Americans and other people of color
by virtue of the law. So the fact that the law that
was passed to protect us is being used against us.
And by us raising our hands to say that the law, although it's not unfair, the law is there to protect citizens' ability to have representation, not even voting, but representation, is now being used to say that white men or white folks at large are being discriminated against because of what? They're not being represented when they're overrepresented just based on population numbers. That is, I mean, listen, with all due respect, Congressman, that is flat out the stuff that Joe Biden refers to as malarkey. So I'll keep it clean out of respect to you and to all of our listeners. But I have to, let me ask you this question. When you see these things, when you see this, for lack of better words, horror show of legislation, or in this case, in many cases, just executive orders and an ask from the president to fumble with the numbers, how do you guys deal with that when you're sitting in caucuses, and you're on a number of caucuses, but as a group, the 215 essentially of you sit, how do you navigate that? I mean, as a team, and you sit down and with Leader Jeffries and you say, okay, what are we going to do to fight against this? That is the question, Representative, that I will tell you that people want to know an answer to. They want to know behind the closed doors, when you guys sit down and say, okay, this is what we're dealing with. What's the strategy? I mean, American voters, those that didn't vote and those that did vote in this last national election, that is the overarching question. What is going on with our elected officials? How are they dealing with this? How are you planning? What are you coming out with? Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And as you can appreciate it, there's 435 members and there's 435 ways to get here. And, of course, there are 435 opinions. So if there are 215 Democrats, there are actually maybe 212 because there's a Democratic seat, if you will, in Houston that was last occupied by Congressman Sylvester Turner. He died in office, and Greg Abbott has not put that seat back up for election. So the people of Houston are going to be without a representative for almost a year because he won't put it in there. So they're holding back on us being able to refill the seats of people that have died. There's another one of the seats in Virginia that they're holding back. So we're down to maybe 213 because of Democrats that have died in office this year that the governor has not put back up for re-election in the state of Virginia and of Texas. And so I think that the Democratic Party should take an affirmative action, an affirmative stance on diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a value. It's not simply a law. You can't outlaw something that's not a law. It's aspirational. Out of many, we're one. E pluribus unum. Like, how can you turn back? If you look at constitutions in France and Finland and Mongolia and other places, women have to have seats in their legislature. And we've kind of retreated. So I raised my voice to say, this is a value that the president is wrong. And by the way, in the Students for Fair Admission, having the military can use affirmative action to promote within so they can have diversity, so they can have cohesion of the troops. Mm-hmm. And if corporations want to have it, they should. And if they don't, okay, they don't have to. But I think the market will, in turn, answer that. And like John Deere and other places, their shareholders have said, we support diversity. John Deere shareholders.
Yeah, they
so there are people that are like, yeah, so this is a multicultural, multi-pluralistic country. How can you not embrace diversity? There will be no dominant single race in the country. So this is a guardrail, a ramp to move us forward with progress. So that's one thing. So, no, we do not come to consensus on that, unfortunately. And what you're beginning to see is the volition and the pure weight of all the things that Mr. Trump is doing. He's isolating himself. And if you will, it's almost like a King Lear play. He's beginning to implode. On that April 2nd date of Liberation Day, where he said, we're going to tear up the whole world. I'm like, wow, this is the most insane thing I think I've seen in a long time. Our economy is 18% of the world's population. Population-wise of the world economy, we're 4.5% of the world's population. He just told 95.5% of the world to trade amongst each other. And this week is why you've seen on the 80th day of the end of World War II, you've seen Putin, Kim Jong-un, and Xi Jinping and Iran all celebrating together, and he's forcing them to create new economic alliances. So he's made this isolation and not a level of dominance. And you remember the vulgar thing the president said, people are going to come here to kiss me all over because they want to do deals with us. Well, that didn't happen. People are finding a way to maintain their dignity and trade with one another without us.
I spoke about that last week and again earlier this week. You're listening to Choose Views on WCPT AM 820 in Chicago, WARR 1520 AM and 103.5 FM from Warren County, North Carolina. I'm Richard Chu. We're talking to Illinois Congressman Jonathan Jackson. As we wrap up, Congressman, one of the questions that I know a lot of folks are probably dying for me to ask you this, given that you and I both are Chicago natives, this is our home. We've been blessed to travel this country and go so many different places. And one thing for sure right now is the occupation or the potential occupation of our communities, all of our communities in Chicago, black, brown, non-black, non-brown communities, do not need the National Guard in the city of Chicago, and frankly, in any U.S. city. So give us your take on this. I know it's been exhausting for you to have to deal with this, both as a citizen of Chicago, but also as a U.S. Congressman. But help us understand where you stand in this conversation.
Yeah, this is an attempt at race baiting and fear-mongering. There are cities and states, 8 out of the 10 most dangerous states, are Republican-led, and all those other numbers, and we're not even the top 100 in the top 90 cities for per capita. Let me be clear. One murder's too many. So I don't want to be on the other side defending that, we're down from murders. One murder's too many. So any intervention that can help save somebody, save some child's life. I don't want to wake up another day saying the stray bullet went through. But we need to talk with the mayor, talk with the county board president, talk with the governor to see how they're moving these numbers down and how the president can give them assistance by giving them more funding for their policing, more programs for the children. Those things have a higher return than putting soldiers, American soldiers, on American streets against American citizens. I mean, that's flies in the front of the face of soldiers, of citizens, of a civil society. My concern is when one of these incidents goes wrong because the soldiers are there to defend themselves and to protect us from enemies abroad. They're not here to protect us from violence from within. That's policing and patrolling and investigation. That's not their skill. When, God forbid, something happens and people start pulling out guns, there are over 400 million guns. There are guns everywhere. Yeah. This thing could erupt into a bloodbath and a horrific summer. I mean, it's just awful. It puts us on edge. I first saw the troops on the ground here in Washington, D.C. earlier this week when I returned after our August recess, and I dozed off in the car and woke up and saw them fortified around the baseball stadium, and my heart skipped a beat. I was like, ooh, that doesn't feel good. All the tan trucks, armory. It's like, oh, my gosh. And so I don't want to see a soldier put in harm's way. I don't want to see a police in harm's way. I don't want to see a citizen put in harm's way. So this man is juggling with knives with greasy hands, by putting our soldiers on the streets. And he wants to use this as a deflection for this worldwide, quarter of a century, thousands of people involved in this pimping episode. I'm so tired of them calling it sex and child trafficking. It's pimping. We know the name of it. They exploited these children, and they want to deflect and give another headline at the expense of our soldiers. So this is red meat for his base to say, danger, 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 like Lost in Space.
Danger, Will Robinson.
Come on, man.
Yeah, Danger Will Robinson. I'm a couple years older than you, but we both experienced that growing up. And that phrase is the phrase that you use, and I know we got to wrap up, Congressman, and we look forward to having you back. But that phrase is a good visual for people. Right now, Donald Trump is juggling knives with greasy hands, and that is a dangerous, dangerous thing to do. And that's a good label for his entire regime right now, not just on National Guard issues, but on the economy, on tariffs, on all of this. That's what Donald Trump is doing and his regime is doing. Congressman Jonathan Jackson, we appreciate your leadership. We know it's not easy, but we know that you went there with the goal of fighting for all Americans, not just those that are here in the 1st Congressional District in Illinois. And we thank you for your leadership, and we're going to keep pushing you, keeping you, aligned as best we can to help you do the best job that you possibly can in that role. And we look forward to having you back in the near future. Does that sound good?
I'm honored to be here, and I thank you for the time. And let me come back, please.
I will let you. I will let you come back and we'll do it all over again. Stay safe, Congressman.
I appreciate you, Charlie.
All right,
great work.
Talk to you soon.
I enjoy listening to you, man.
Thank you. Appreciate that. All right, be well. Take care. Stay safe. Bye-bye. Oh my goodness, good to talk to him. He is I say this respectfully, Congressman Jackson is a character. He's a funny dude. I've sat with him and we've joked in different venues, and he's always one that likes to cut up. But the phrase he used is very appropriate. Donald Trump's regime right now is a regime that is juggling knives with greasy hands. Look, think about that visual, you guys. He's juggling knives and, frankly, our lives with greasy hands. And so is the entire GOP. Thanks to Congressman Jackson for being with us this morning. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Choose Views on WCPT, AM 820 in Chicago, and WARR 1520 AM and 103.5 FM from Warren County, North Carolina. I'm Richard Chu. We'll be right back.
Check up on health with Chris Whitting.
It's estimated about 250,000 accidents each year are caused by underinflated tires. Donald Shea of the Rubber Manufacturers of America.
We're urging consumers once a month to take 5 minutes to check the air pressure in each of their tires, including the spare, to make sure they have a properly inflated tire. Before any long trip, check your air pressure.
But where do we find out what the pressure should be?
Check your owner's manual. There's a notice on the doorpost of your vehicle or the door itself, which will tell you what the proper inflation pressure is, as well as what's the proper load for that tire in that vehicle. There's no worse combination than an underinflated, overloaded vehicle.
The Rubber Manufacturers Association's slogan is, "Be tire smart, do your part." Aside from tire pressure, make sure your alignment, tire rotation, and tread depth are also okay. With Checkup on Health, I'm Chris Whitting.
This is WCPT telling you how you can shop blue. Donald Trump has implemented a barbaric anti-immigration policy with mass deportations and having ICE agents showing up unannounced at people's homes, workplaces, and anywhere they suspect, separating families, ruining lives, and deporting people without any due process. But one company is taking a stand against Donald Trump. Greyhound Bus Lines has implemented a no warrant, no boarding policy. This prohibits ICE agents to enter the vehicle without a warrant. Greyhound Bus says they want to guarantee the rights and civil liberties of their passengers. Greyhound Bus is the largest inner-city bus system in the U.S., with over 1,600 destinations. Maybe this will lead to more companies stepping up like Greyhound is. This has been WCPT telling you how you can shop blue.
Viking, dedicated to creating travel experiences for the thinking person, with programs designed for cultural enrichment on board and on shore. Discover more at Viking.com.
AP News, I'm Marcela Sanchez. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff met with European leaders in Paris today to discuss security guarantees for Ukraine. For months, the so-called Coalition of the Willing has been meeting to discuss aid for Ukraine, including sketching out plans for military support in the event of a ceasefire to deter future Russian aggression. And in the House yesterday, lawmakers rallied support for a bill that would prohibit members of Congress and their families from owning and trading individual stocks. At a news conference, Representative Tim Burchett, a conservative from Tennessee, says the stock trading ban is something both sides should agree on.
This body has been enriching itself on the taxpayers' dime, and dadgummit, it's got to stop. The president's already said he would sign a bill banning stock trading for members of Congress if passed. I think the real test is going to be whether Congress has the guts to stand up and do what's right.
And Florida plans to become the first state to eliminate vaccine mandates. The state surgeon general cast current requirements in schools and elsewhere as an immoral intrusion on people's rights. And in Washington, D.C., survivors demanded the release of the sex trafficking investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. The women went to Capitol Hill yesterday to share their experiences and call for transparency and accountability. In Portugal, the death toll in the Lisbon streetcar crash rose to 17 after 2 people died from their injuries in a hospital. Another 21 people were injured, including a 3-year-old child. And in Afghanistan, hundreds of bodies have been recovered from houses destroyed by a 6.0 magnitude earthquake on Sunday. A Taliban government spokesman says the death toll has risen to more than 2,200. This is AP News. AP correspondent Ben Thomas reports the latest immigration detention center is a notorious Louisiana prison.
This camp was originally built here at Angola to house the most disruptive of prisoners.
Governor Jeff Landry says after years of neglect, a complex inside the Louisiana State Penitentiary is being put back in service.
To help fulfill the mission of removing criminal, illegal aliens that have been causing havoc in our communities.
This is a facility that's notorious.
Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem says it's been deliberately chosen to encourage people living illegally in the U.S. to self-deport.
You're going to end up here because we're going to throw the book at you and everything else that we have until you're out of this country, and you no longer have the right to be free and no longer have the right to be in the United States of America.
I'm Ben Thomas.
And the British rock band Radiohead will...
This is 820 AM, WCPT Willow Springs, and streaming worldwide at WCPT820.com. We are Chicago's progressive talk, where facts matter. Now, your WCPT 820 weather update.
From the Weatherology Weather Center, I'm meteorologist Jennifer Wojcicki. We'll see sunny skies here for today with a high in the upper 60s. Northwest winds of 5 to 10 miles per hour, gusting as high as 20. Then for tonight, partly cloudy, a low near 56. By Friday, sunshine, breezy, high of 66 degrees. Then on Saturday, plenty of blue skies and sun, a high around 68. Sunday, mostly sunny, high of 67. That's your latest Chicago weather update.
Currently, it's 50.
Here's the tale of the daily med fill. Same old pharmacy, same old bill, but those prices kept rising higher still.
Till the savings wrangler rode in, cool as can be. Tap Good RX, saving massively.
No plan? Don't matter none. Up to 80% off. The deals are done.
Discounts hitting harder than Ma's chili. Dang. That one little app does all the rest.
Save time and money on prescriptions.
Check Good RX. Good RX is not insurance.
Hey Google, play WCPT.
Streaming Chicago's progressive talk from TuneIn.
Welcome back to Choose Views with Richard Chew.
Hey guys, welcome back to the show. It's great having Congressman Jonathan Jackson on with us this morning. And I love joking with him because he's kind of a cut up in his non-congressman hat. But good to have him with us. And one of the things I want to say is that if you have, I shouldn't say if you have, all of us have a congressional leader where we live, whoever he or she may be. Here's what I want you guys to do. If we're going to help, let's give something that's a constructive thing. And I'm sure our guest in a moment will appreciate this. Let us know if you want us to reach out to your congressional leader in your district anywhere in the country. We had a person that called in during the break that put this out there. If you have a congressional leader that you want us to talk to on our show, let us know. Send me an email at richard@WCPT820.com. If you happen to have an inside phone number, I mean, listen, I'm just being transparent. Send it to me. We'll reach out to them. If you got an inside email, I know that we can go through the normal channels, and that's what we do. However, if there's someone you want us to talk to that's a congressional leader, House or Senate on a national level, let us know, and we'll do our dead level best to make that happen. If you have a state legislator that you want us to talk with, same thing applies. Don't be bashful. Let us know, and we will do our best to get them on the show to talk about the things that are important to you in your state area or your congressional district that obviously are concerns for us nationally. Everything that's local is national right now, and everything that's national is local. I believe that, and that's one of the things that's changed in the game. We have to remember this now. Everything that's local is national. Everything that's national is local. But one of the biggest national issues, concerns, bodies of government that we have is the Supreme Court. And a few weeks ago, we were blessed to have one of the primary voices in this space right now that we are blessed to have back with us again this morning, and that's Professor of Law at the University of Michigan, also the co-host of the Strict Scrutiny podcast and author of the recent New York Times bestseller, not kinda, but bestseller, Lawless, How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. Welcome to the show, Professor, I will call her Doc, Leah Litman. Good morning and welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me back and for the very kind introduction.
Well deserved. It's kind, but it's well deserved. And yes, I'm going to call you Doc a few times this morning. I let our listeners know earlier that we would be open to taking some calls for those who want to jingle us this morning that may have a question about the book, about SCOTUS, about all the rulings and the things that you navigate and inform us on every day. So we may get a few calls of people that have a question for you. There may be some ones also, Professor Litman, that are sent to me via text, and if so, I'll read them and we can kind of work through them. But since we talked the last, obviously we're in this constant, on this constant train of movement, and everybody's kind of back in their seats now. House is back, Senate's back, state legislators are back, school is back. And, the Supreme Court is starting to, wind up their engine. What are some of your observations of the court in the last 30 to 60 days?
So I think we have seen a continued trend whereby the Supreme Court is giving Donald Trump and the Trump administration permission to implement many of their policies that have been successfully challenged in the lower federal courts. That is, that lower federal courts have concluded are illegal. And they're doing this on what's called the emergency or the shadow docket, which means they're not granting full review in these cases. They might not even issue opinions, and they certainly aren't going to hear oral argument. Instead, what happens is when a lower court rules against the Trump administration and says, for example, you can't fire this official in violation of federal law, then the Trump administration will run up to the Supreme Court and ask the Supreme Court to pause that lower court ruling and allow the Trump administration to move forward with their conduct that a lower court concluded was illegal. The court has continued to do this at, I think, a pretty astonishing rate, where they keep giving the Trump administration what they want. And I think we are beginning to see a lot of the frustration and disappointment and disillusionment with what the Supreme Court is doing bubbling up in the lower federal courts, which are trying to continue to do their jobs.
So the shadow docket, if you could, you helped us with that, but help us a little bit more, because the word that came to mind for me is transparency. Yeah. How is the Supreme Court, what is it that gives them the power to implement or to maybe not implement, but to act in that way with something that is a case that's gone through the federal court? So it's no longer a case that, if you would say, is not private's not the right word, but not aware by the American people. How does that happen with this shadow docket?
So I think many people are aware of how much Congress has ceded to the president significant powers. I think what people might not appreciate is the extent to which Congress has also given the Supreme Court a lot of power and taken the back seat. So the Supreme Court has near complete and total control over what cases they hear and also the manner in which it hears them. And that has given rise to this shadow or emergency docket. And I think everyone agrees that in some cases, we need there to be an emergency or shadow docket. Think about, for example, capital cases where an individual who has been sentenced to death receives their execution date, but they want to challenge, the method that the state is going to use to execute them. Well, they might have to ask the Supreme Court to stay on an emergency basis to pause the state's execution date, to allow them to challenge what the state is doing. So everyone agrees that the Supreme Court needs some power to hear emergency applications. I think the problem is Congress has just given the Supreme Court near plenary control over what kinds of issues it hears on the shadow docket, whether it has to issue opinions at all. And I think the Supreme Court is abusing that authority to basically do a lot of solids for the Trump administration.
So with this, essentially, they are pausing. They're pausing the lower court's ruling and then not ruling themselves.
Yep.
And so if the ruling is favorable to the Trump administration, then essentially that stands to be, for lack of better words, for us lay people, that stands to be the law, or at least the ruling on that case that was brought to the court lower than the Supreme Court.
It's law, but without law, because when they pause these lower court rulings, they don't tell the lower courts why they're doing it. And these cases have to continue in the lower federal courts with federal judges just guessing what the Supreme Court will do if is up to. Exactly.
Wow. Okay, so that's got to cause you some gray hair. As a law professor, sorry, I'm just a real dude.
I'm not the victim here, right? The lower courts and the country and the litigants are. I mean, this is no way to run a rodeo.
No, it's not. But as a professor and someone that looks at this from a distance and then with a magnifying glass, how do you look at that? And then as a person that if you were a judge, could rule on cases, how do you comport yourself in that from the lenses that you use?
So as a lower federal court judge, the lower federal courts are bound by Supreme Court decisions. So, of course, it's their job to apply the law that the Supreme Court has given them. But the problem is, when the Supreme Court doesn't tell them how or why the Supreme Court disagreed with what they did, the lower federal courts don't have much to go on. And even when the Supreme Court does provide some explanation or reasoning, it's quite cursory and difficult to parse. We had a ruling yesterday from a federal judge in Boston that concluded the administration's freezing of, millions, billions of dollars of grants to Harvard University was illegal. And the judge wrote, I think, a pretty remarkable footnote saying, look, I am trying to apply the Supreme Court's decisions, but the reality is, when there are emergency postures and you're not giving me a lot of reasons, there's only so much I can do. And I just think that is remarkable candor from a lower federal court who basically said the Supreme Court shouldn't be criticizing us when they reach a different conclusion. Because if you're not going to give us any reasoning or only super short 4 sentences that just talk about the facts, they have no idea what they should be doing. And so, I mean, this lower federal court judge said, look, I'm trying to apply precedent, but this court respectfully submits that it is unhelpful and unnecessary to criticize district courts for defying the Supreme Court when they are working to find the right answer in a rapidly evolving doctrinal landscape where they must grapple with both existing precedent and interim guidance from the Supreme Court that appears to set precedent aside without explanation or consensus. And so I think the lower federal courts are still really trying to do their jobs, which is apply the law as it is. But they are rightfully frustrated with the position the Supreme Court has put them in.
That the questions that are going to come this morning are going to be probably ones that many people are how do I want to put this, are afraid to ask because they worry that the answer is one that won't be promising. But we're still going to try to get to them as best we can. You're listening to Choose Views on WCPT AM 820 in Chicago and WARR 1520 AM and 103.5 FM in Warren County, North Carolina. I'm Richard Chu. We are talking to Professor Leah Litman and co-host of Strict Scrutiny, a podcast about the Supreme Court of the United States of America. So, Professor Litman, I want to go back to something that I concluded last year. Now, I'm not a legal scholar. I've studied the law, have for years, and fascinated by it, always have been. But last year, with this conversation around presidential immunity, and a lot of people got really upset about it, as we should have. in terms of what the Supreme Court had determined and how that ruling came about. One of the take I took on it was a little bit different than what a lot of people took, and I introduced this thought. Excuse me. Here's my thought. My thought at that time was the immunity was really about giving the Supreme Court more power, veiled or masked, covered in it's giving the president or presidency more power. I looked at it and said that because of the way in which this was written, that the Supreme Court just said, we have ultimate sign-off power on what we think is a presidential act. Mm-hmm. And that now has sort of feathered its way out into so many other areas, and particularly based on what you just described as it relates to the way in which the federal courts don't really have some of the direction that they need. The immunity actually, in my mind, gave the Supreme Court more power. Help us understand. Am I way out in left field on this one, or is there some reasonable thought to what I sort of interpreted?
I think when we consider the immunity ruling and we're asking, did this expand the president's power? Did this expand the Supreme Court's power? To my mind, it's kind of a why not both? I mean, of course, this expanded the president's power by basically removing a swath of potential consequences the president might face for violating federal law. On the other hand, when will presidents actually face consequences for violating federal laws? Well, that is going to be determined by the Supreme Court when it said there are going to be questions about when the president's powers are exclusive, such that Congress cannot touch what the president is doing at all. Those questions are going to be resolved by the Supreme Court ultimately. Similarly, when there are questions about, is the president entitled to presumptive immunity when the president and Congress are acting in a shared space of authority? Those questions, whether the presumption of immunity is rebutted, that's going to be resolved by the Supreme Court too. I think this Supreme Court loves to arrogate power to itself. And you're right that this oftentimes happens at the expense of the lower federal courts. If you think back to the end of this most recent Supreme Court term with the case on the birthright citizenship executive order, Justice Brett Kavanaugh wrote a remarkable concurrence in which he said, it's not for the lower federal courts to resolve these legal issues on a nationwide basis and to determine what the executive branch can do while their policies are being challenged. That's up to me. That's up to the Supreme Court. Only the Supreme Court can resolve these issues on a nationwide basis. So I think they are absolutely gathering more power for themselves. That oftentimes comes at the expense of Congress. At the same time, they are giving more power to the president.
So it's a little bit of both in terms of how that was determined. It just felt like that when I read through the ruling, it felt like because so many things were left undetermined as to what an executive action was, and that the Supreme Court would be able to determine that it said that we have the power to say yay or nay or somewhere in the middle, and how the federal courts are having to kind of beg for some help seems that it's bearing itself out a little bit in that way. So thanks for that clarification. What popped into my mind when you said the removal of some of the power from Congress, interestingly, what popped into my head is the unitary executive theory and how that is providing Congress with less actionable power, and not just the presidency, which is what the unitary executive theory is all about. And I say theory because it is a theory, but the court system or the Supreme Court being kind of carving out their part of their own version of a unitary, legal position. Do you see what I'm saying? They've kind of carved out their own expanding of power.
Yes. So the unitary executive theory is this idea that was really developed during the administration of Ronald Reagan and then continuously peddled by the conservative right-wing legal movement that maintains that the Constitution gives the president all of the executive power such that the president has to, at a minimum, be able to control all of the individuals who are exercising significant amounts of executive power within the administrative state or within the executive branch. And that idea already, generates a conclusion that the president can violate certain federal laws, namely those federal laws that limit the president's power to remove certain federal officials, like the heads of the National Labor Relations Board, for example, or the Consumer Product Safety Commission. And because the unitary executive theory maintains that the executive power that is given to the president by the Constitution includes some powers, such as the power to fire people within the executive branch, that aren't actually mentioned in the constitutional text. You're right, that necessarily invites the question of, well, what other powers does the president have that aren't actually specifically and explicitly mentioned in the Constitution? And that issue, what powers the president has and which federal laws can constitutionally limit the president's powers, that's going to be resolved by the Supreme Court. So there, too, they are giving themselves the power to decide the relative authority of Congress and the executive branch. And they have oftentimes weighed in favor of the president at the expense of Congress.
And it seems to be growing more and more in terms of the push in that direction. I've heard some of the, speeches or interviews or whatever that Stephen Miller has been a part of, and he talks about, the president having all power, and his power shall not be, questioned. And we can go down the path of how, how Third Reichish that sounds and how Hitler-esque that sounds. But at the end of the day, we have people in the administration or people in the regime, as I'm calling it, Professor Litman, pushing that narrative, pushing that conversation strongly. And what concerns me, and going back to transparency, is what's going on behind closed doors to continue to eat away at those, these pillars that we've had in place for decades, if not centuries, that have allowed us to navigate, reasonably well. And so that's where my concern is the lack of transparency. And if the Supreme Court, through their shadow dockets and other ways, are pausing rulings and giving more power indirectly or directly to the presidency, it's a huge recipe for disaster.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, we are seeing the consequences, right, every day of giving the president so much unrestricted power. It is a recipe for chaos and for disorder. As the president calls up the National Guards and deploys them, to cities that he perceives as basically his political opposition, that he harbors grudges at because of the Black Lives Matter protests, that were happening in many of those places. And so we can all see with our eyes the consequence of giving one person that much power. And yet the Supreme Court is pushing us further and further toward the end of the spectrum in which the president truly has even more power and is effectively allowed to act like a king.
There's a question that we have regarding shadow dockets, and I'll try to narrow this down. The question is, if shadow docket rulings only apply to the case that's before the Supreme Court, meaning if another case of the exact nature is working its way through the system, the previous shadow docket ruling has no standing on a different case of the exact same nature. Does that make sense, how I read that.
Yes. So maybe I'll rephrase the question slightly. So the question is, when the Supreme Court says on the shadow docket, this case number 1 is paused. Let's imagine there's a second case number 2. Do the judges have to apply the Supreme Court's shadow docket orders from case number 1 to case number 2? And the answer is the Supreme Court for the last several years has provided pretty conflicting guidance on that issue, but more recently has come down on the side of lower federal courts have to apply their shadow docket rulings. That is what generated the criticism from Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh that the district judge was pushing back against. Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Gorsuch wrote separately to accuse a lower federal court of defying the Supreme Court's shadow docket order in another case. The previous case involved the Department of Education and how and where to challenge when the administration freezes funds that are given out by the Department of Education. Well, the most recent case was about the National Institutes of Health. How and where do you challenge grants when the National Institutes of Health refuse to pay them out? And so even though that's a different case involving a different agency, different grants, right, and different cases that seek different kinds of reliefs, Justices Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, went out of their way to chastise the lower federal courts for declining to read their very conclusory, very unclear, few short sentences in that previous shadow docket case. And that's not the only case where they've done this, faulting the lower federal courts for failing to divine what they mean in some shadow docket orders, sometimes even the orders that don't provide any reasoning at all.
That's fascinating. It really is. We've got a few more questions, but we're going to take a break. What I heard, the first thing that popped into my mind when you started to answer that question and reframe that question, Professor Litman, is Lawless. And that's the title of the book, How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. I'm holding it up to the camera for those of you who want to see it. We posted it yesterday, and you're listening to Choose Views on WCPT AM 820 in Chicago, WARR 1520 AM and 103.5 FM from Warren County, North Carolina. I'm Richard Chu. We'll be right back.
Hear that? That's what having fewer hot flashes and night sweats can sound like. Veoza is the #1 prescribed hormone-free treatment FDA approved for moderate to severe vasomotor symptoms, also known as hot flashes and night sweats, due to menopause. Veoza can cause serious side effects, including liver problems. Your doctor will do blood tests before and during treatment. Stop Veoza and call your doctor if you have symptoms of liver problems, such as feeling more tired than usual, decreased appetite, nausea, vomiting, itching, yellowing of the eyes or skin, pale stool, dark urine, or stomach pain. Don't use Veoza if you have cirrhosis, severe kidney problems, kidney failure, or take CYP1A2 inhibitors. Ask your doctor about Veoza. To learn more, call 1-866-239-1637 or go to Veoza.com. That's VEOZAH.com. Paid for by Astellas Pharma.
You're listening to WCPT 820. Here's the latest Chicago weather update.
From the Weatherology Weather Center, I'm meteorologist Jennifer Wojcicki. We'll see sunny skies here for today with a high in the upper 60s. Northwest winds of 5 to 10 miles per hour, gusting as high as 20. Then for tonight, partly cloudy, a low near 56. By Friday, sunshine, breezy, high of 66 degrees. Then on Saturday, plenty of blue skies and sun, a high around 68. Sunday, mostly sunny, high of 67. That's your latest Chicago weather update.
Currently, it's 50.
WCPT 820, Chicago's progressive talk, where facts matter.
Good morning. You're waking up with Richard Chu.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning.
We're live and ready to hear from you. Text or call us now at 773-763-9278. Same number. Simple as that. Let's get the conversation going on WCPT 820, Chicago's progressive talk.
Hey guys, welcome back to Choose Views. We are talking with Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School, and also co-host of Scrutiny, which is a wonderful podcast about the Supreme Court of the United States and the lawlessness, which is the title of the book from Professor Leah Litman, how the Supreme Court runs on conservative grievance, fringe theories, and bad vibes. When Professor Litman was on with us a few weeks ago, I asked her a little bit more about what are some of those fringe theories and what are some of those, what is some of that conservative grievance? And we talked about that. And I kind of want to launch into that again because we have a question that ties to something that you talked a little bit earlier about in terms of historical decisions of the Supreme Court. So the question is about originalism and the decisions in the Plessy 1896 and Brown in 1954, which is, largely been rationalized under the originalist framework. So the question is, kind of your take on that. How plausible is the claim that was made by Scalia, if you remember back, that he asserted that he would have joined Harlan's decision in Plessy? Help us understand the originalist context of that decision.
Where to start? How plausible it is? I'll start with the conclusion, not so plausible at all. So maybe a little bit of background. Plessy versus Ferguson, of course, is the infamous case where the Supreme Court upheld separate but equal segregation, a law that required train cars, to operate separate cars for white passengers and separate cars for black passengers. Justice Harlan, as you know, dissented in that case. He would have invalidated separate but equal segregation. I think that originalists, that is, people who ascribe to the idea that the Constitution should and must be interpreted according to its original meaning, have felt, let's say, pressure or compulsion to say this method of constitutional interpretation, originalism, can explain Brown. Because Brown versus Board of Education, the decision invalidating segregation, is so fundamental in our constitutional system that if your constitutional theory can't explain Brown, your constitutional theory isn't so plausible after all. So the originalist case for Brown and for Justice Harlan's dissent in Plessy basically runs like this. Look at the words of the Equal Protection Clause. I'll give your listeners a few seconds. You can stare at the page. It says no state shall deny, right, equal protection of the laws. And their claim is the original meaning of those words is just so clear, obviously, it invalidates segregation. Now, the counter to that is, if that was so obvious, why, when the 14th Amendment was ratified, when the Equal Protection Clause was ratified, did states and the federal government continue to operate segregated schools for almost a century? That is, the people that drafted and ratified the 14th Amendment didn't seem to think that amendment meant segregation is illegal. And the widespread practice of segregation, particularly segregation in schools or what the Supreme Court had referred to as, social settings aside from political rights, the idea that these widespread practices can just be ignored because the text is so clear, I think that is a tough sell.
I would dare say, and thank you for that clarification and explanation. I would dare say that it is one of the bases. It is one of the base cases, if not the base case, for all conversations now around what the Trump administration is trying to do when it comes to taking away rights of communities I use the word marginalized carefully, but have been the attempt to marginalize communities such as the LGBTQ plus community, obviously the African American community, and other communities of color, immigrants, and certainly even women at large. The Plessy case and the Brown case are touchstones, is the word I'm looking for where the Trump administration is now when it comes to their desire to take away so much from so many people. What are your thoughts there?
Yes, I mean, I think you can see the ways in which the Trump administration is, in my view, really attempting to move us back to a time of segregation. Like, I think they are making various moves that would resegregate education, that would resegregate the workforce. I mean, there has been recent reporting about how their mass firings of federal officials, people that work in the federal government, has disproportionately affected Black women and Black employees. We have seen examples where the Trump administration has ostentatiously reviewed high-ranking, federal officials who are women or who are Black. They seem to be operating under some kind of presumption that any, woman, any minority, any racial minority who holds a position of power didn't get it and didn't earn it and isn't qualified to be there. And we see this, I think, particularly clearly in their actions related to education, where they have begun to demand from schools admissions data, asking the schools, tell us how many white students, how many Black students, how many Native students you are admitting. And the premise of their claim, which I think Stephen Miller has made quite explicit, is that unless enrollment numbers drop for racial minorities, that's evidence that the schools are doing something illegal. Because in their view, these schools should be less integrated than they already are.
There's a question that leads me down a dark path, Professor, that I tend to stay away from. I see that dark path and I go, no, not for me. And it's a question around letting the Supreme Court, the members on the right, if you will, or the more right-leaning based on their judicial decisions, that they need to feel a little bit of heat from the American people, and if not from congressional leaders as it relates to their ability to stay in their robes. And what I mean by that is this conversation about how do we fix the Supreme Court. And one of the things that has been talked about a lot, and I know you've heard it and you've leaned into it based on some of the things you've discussed on your podcast, and that is, what are the fixes for the Supreme Court? What are the fixes for this problematic group that has given themselves seemingly more power and volleying back and forth with the president in terms of both of those legs of the stool being more powerful? What do we? There's conversation out there: court packing, term limits, reforms, ethic reforms is the thing that I was reading. But what are your thoughts about that in terms of changing the number of justices? Let's start with that one, and then we'll get to a couple of the others that I know you are aware of.
Yes. So when it comes to Supreme Court reform, I am firmly in the yes and camp. That is, I think conversations about the Supreme Court need to be part of conversations about where we go from here, how we build ourselves back, how we build ourselves differently. I think, going back to an earlier part of our conversation, I think a lot of people look at the situation we find ourselves in now, and they understand that the president has too much power, and that when things change, Congress should do things to limit the scope of the president's power going forward. I think more people should be attuned to the ways in which the Supreme Court has enabled the rise of presidential power, has allowed these abuses of executive authority, and has also degraded our democracy in many different ways. And so the reason why I think Supreme Court expansion has to be on the table is basically this. Imagine that tomorrow Democrats control the White House and Congress, and they pass a law that attempts to restrict the president's authority, to conduct these terrifying, bombings of, individuals who might be migrants, right, fleeing from Venezuela. They try to limit the extent to which the president can expel people to foreign torture prisons. They try to limit the extent to which the president can just round up, non-citizen grad students on the basis of their speech. I personally think this Supreme Court would invalidate a lot of those laws, as well as, protections for voting rights. And if that's right, then you have to reform the Supreme Court. You have to expand the number of justices in order to allow our country to actually pass laws that would fix the problems we are facing now.
So you are in that camp of some people use the phrase court packing. I don't think that that's really the word that I would use. I just think expansion to match with to a great extent the districts, the number of districts that are out there. But you're looking at it from a even more tactical a standpoint as it relates to the other two branches of government, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yes, that's exactly right. I think that it would also be good to expand the Supreme Court, for, as you say, having, justices who oversee, each circuit. Right now, some justices are the circuit justices for multiple circuits, and, other justices are just the circuit justice for one circuit. I think increasing the diversity of the kinds of people who serve on the Supreme Court, that would also be a salutary benefit of expanding the Supreme Court. But yes, I definitely think about it in terms of what is necessary for our democracy moving forward to ensure we don't find ourselves in this situation of extreme minority rule. Again, with a leader who has autocratic impulses and designs. And to my mind, the things we need to do to get from here to there, those are things the Supreme Court is just not going to allow us to do, like trying to get dark money out of elections, for example. They've already said, they won't allow the country to do that. And so I just think, therefore, purely from the perspective of our democracy and how to fix it, you have to fix the Supreme Court.
Yeah, that's so powerful, so incredibly powerful of a statement. You're listening to Choose Views on WCPT AM 820 in Chicago and WARR 1520 AM and 103.5 FM from Warren County, North Carolina. I'm Richard Chu. We are talking to Professor Leah Litman, who is the author of this phenomenal book called Lawless: How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. So we're gonna fix the Supreme Court, Professor Litman, by changing the number of justices. Ethics reform is a big part of it, but let's go with that other elephant in the room in this conversation, and that's the one about term limits. Yep. And if we went down that path, obviously that's a congressional determination. And let me back up and let you tell us. I don't want to tell you, unless as a student it said, Richard, raise your hand and ask your question. But tell us how, one, your thoughts about that in terms of term limits, and secondly, how that would be implemented and who has the power to make it happen.
Yeah, so I think term limits are a great idea. We are really unique among constitutional democracies in having a constitutional court with justices who don't have term limits. I think term limits have all sorts of benefits, regularizing the process of appointment so voters know when they go to vote for a president, I am selecting someone who is going to appoint 1 to 2 justices. I think they ensure the justices don't become too comfortable and entitled, such that maybe they're just accepting, largesse from billionaires, hypothetically. Mm-hmm. I think term limits are good for all sorts of reasons. As to how to do them, I am personally of the view that Congress could impose term limits on justices that are appointed in the future. I don't think Congress could retroactively impose term limits on the justices who are already on the Supreme Court. So, but I should acknowledge there are debates. There are some people who think that in order to even impose term limits on justices appointed in the future, that would require a constitutional amendment because the text of the Constitution says federal judges shall serve for good behavior. So there is a debate about whether the Constitution allows Congress to impose term limits on future nominees or justices on the Supreme Court. But my own personal view is that Congress could do so by legislation.
Got it. Okay, so then let's talk, as that process were to work itself out and we have the right members in Congress. And when I say right, Professor Litman, every now and again, I have to be, people say, well, let's be nonpartisan on these conversations. Sometimes I think you have to, well, not sometimes, you always have to pick a side. You always have to determine where you're going to plant your flag, in my humble experience in life. Because if you don't do that, then what do you actually stand for? And one of the things that I love about your book and your work is that you take a stand. I mean, you always take a side with how you've reviewed things, and certainly in your writings, but you take a stand on things. You're very, very clearly concise about what you believe, with some room for things to be, quote unquote, discussed and negotiated, if you will. But you take a stand. And that's one of the things that I appreciate in this short, period of time that I've come to know you and learn about you. So let's talk a little bit about the political nature and climate that we're in right now. When you see folks that are elected to office not taking a stand, how does that impact you as someone that does take a stand?
I mean, I just think, why on earth did you want to hold political office, right? Like, if you don't want to take a stand or stand for anything or try to make people's lives better, I would hope that it is based on a desire to serve the public good, right? To fight for principles that you think are important to our representative government that people choose to run for office. And, the unfortunate reality is, I think too many of our elected officials and other officials have come to view power as an end itself. That is, they think they are doing the right thing as long as they do whatever is necessary to stay in power. Mm-hmm. And that just ain't it. Again, no one is entitled to hold political office. They owe that, right, and have a responsibility to the public. And so if you don't care enough about principles that make our government representative, that ensure government serves the people, I just think, what on earth are you doing? Yeah. A lot of people, going back to and sort of tying this into taking a stand and into the conversation around increasing the Supreme Court's number, a lot of people feel that during President Biden's first 2 years that, the numbers were there in some ways to make that change in terms of appointing additional judges to the Supreme Court. Others differ in their thoughts on that. I'd like to know where you stand or where you stood at that time on that subject. On the Supreme Court's relationship to politics? No. I apologize. What President Biden during his first 2 years in office and the ability to change the number of justices at that time. Got it. Yeah, so I was firmly on the side of we should reform the Supreme Court when we have the power to do it. I just don't think you can wait until the emergency, right, has become worse, until the crisis has become worse, until it has become more difficult to solve the problem. I mean, it was readily apparent where the Republican Party was headed during the first few years of the Biden administration. They were still, right, entertaining Donald Trump, even as he offered, lies about the 2020 presidential election, even as he, engaged and facilitated in the attempt to, in my view, overthrow the government by storming the Capitol on January 6th. And we had enough signs or signals about the Supreme Court's sympathies and the kind of justices that the Republican Party was appointing. So in my view, there was more than enough evidence of how deeply bad things would become in the event of a second Trump administration under this Supreme Court. So I do think Democrats and progressives need to be more proactive rather than reactive and just waiting for things to become so much worse than they are. And I'm hoping that in the event that I shouldn't say in the event we will get through this. It's going to be it already is a pain in the behind. We're going to get through this because we have to, and I'm not just being optimistic. I'm being very pragmatic. We have to get through it, which means that every day everybody's got to fight
and whatever that definition is per person, then that's got to be how you fight. But we can't sit back, to your point, and not be aggressive in our stand, even though on a federal level we don't have the numbers in the House or the Senate. A lot of the state legislatures, though, I'm seeing some changes in areas that we don't anticipate or didn't anticipate that those changes would take place. But I agree with you in terms of fighting is we have to be very proactive, very meaningful, very intentional right now, so that when we are back in the position to make those changes, full stop, no questions asked, no sitting around debating and going, well, let's wait for the right wind to hit the right sail. No, just do it now, to take the phrase from Nike. Let me ask you this as we're kind of wrapping up, and I so appreciate you being with us. I know our listeners have as well, all over the country. We've gotten a number of texts from different people from different parts of the country. So it's been great to chat with you, and I feel like I'm back in one of my law school classes from years ago. So thank you for that. But going back in history, what would you say is the biggest or most landmark case that SCOTUS has decided on?
Oh, gosh, that is a really tough question. I think there are different cases from different periods that have defined the country that we are. Of course, Marbury versus Madison, the decision that said Supreme Court, federal courts get to invalidate federal statutes, on the ground that federal judges think are unconstitutional, even if Congress disagrees with them. That's a big Supreme Court decision. I think Dred Scott versus Sanford, a decision holding, that Black Americans could not be citizens and invalidating the Missouri Compromise. I mean, that is an infamous decision that, in my view, contributed, to the Civil War, and is also important because of what it signals and says about how the Supreme Court has acted in our constitutional democracy. Brown is, of course, a shining moment, and I think what people associate with the Supreme Court and a promise of what the Supreme Court might be or could be. And if I could just add one more.
Sure.
Rucho versus Common Cause. This is a 2019 Roberts Court decision that said the federal courts cannot do anything in response to partisan gerrymandering. And so if you're wondering why there's a nuclear arms race, between Republican-controlled states and the country with this war on partisan gerrymandering, I think that's in no small part because of the Supreme Court and greenlighting partisan gerrymandering, making it harder to challenge. That's part of what makes our democracy, right, in a kind of decline, because it makes it harder to use elections to get the government to respond to the will of the people.
And write the course that we go on. That's the wrong course for the greater good of all the country. Yes, it's a powerful decision. And there's so many others. And I asked that question because I knew that you would say, Richard, now come on now. There's a few out there that we could throw into that conversation. Leah Litman is also a recipient. I didn't get a chance to acknowledge this when we talked before, of the a top honor from the National Association of Women's Lawyers. And I'd say that as we wrap up today, because she's also one of the leading voices when it comes to the Supreme Court. She is, in my mind, the leading voice and a wonderful author of the book Lawless, How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. And we have to have you back again because the Supreme Court is a train that just keeps chugging on down the tracks. And you've been one to, when they stop, to throw some thoughts to what they're doing. So we appreciate that, and we appreciate how hard you've worked to keep us informed on SCOTUS. Last but not least, how can folks find you? We know how folks can get the book, but how can folks find you if they want to follow some of the work that you're doing?
So I am on Blue Sky, just at Leah Litman, where I post about the Supreme Court. My podcast that I co-host, Strict Scrutiny, is also available wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every Monday. And those are, I think, the primary places where you can find me.
Fantastic. Professor Litman, thank you for being with us. There's so many questions and things that are out there and couldn't get them all in. But I'd love to have you back again and maybe make this kind of a regular thing where we help people have a better understanding of the Supreme Court, its history, and where we are currently. Does that sound okay?
Sounds great.
Thanks for being with us. Have a great day, and we'll talk soon. Bye now.
Thank you. You too.
All right, guys, there you go. Two phenomenal people with us this morning, Congressman Jonathan Jackson and author, professor of law at the University of Michigan School of Law, Leah Litman. Thanks for being with us this morning. Take a deep breath, progressives, and make your life count. We'll see you tomorrow.
This is Tony Moray. I'm an estate planning lawyer who drafts living trusts and wills. Since the election, I've been hearing from my clients, many of them fellow WCPT listeners. And we all wonder, how did this happen and what can we do? The how is, of course, very complicated. My thoughts as regard to what we can do is simple but important. We need to take extra care of those we love. Having an estate plan using either a living trust or will can provide comfort in uncertain times like these. When the progressive values we hold dear are under attack, I feel we must make sure that our personal lives are secure and then work out from there. I've been drafting estate plans for my clients for over 30 years, and I will use all of that experience to help you. Please call me at 847-996-0496. My website is moreylawoffice.com. That's Morey spelled M-O-R-E-E. Again, the phone is